Thank you for the invitation to speak here. After 5 weeks of unemployment, it's wonderful to catch up with a few old friends again. And yes, I have been focusing on farming for 5 weeks, and in what's been a very difficult season in the northern part of New South Wales and Queensland, but surprisingly very good yields for the climatic conditions we've had this season. If I think back 10 or 15 years, I know we wouldn't have produced even half the grain that we did this year under those similar climatic conditions. And that's probably a good place to start and talk about globalisation of the Australian grains industry. And when I was asked to speak, I was advised it was a farmer perspective on globalisation of the Australian grains industry. And the best place to start there would be to ask a few farmers their views on globalisation, the impacts it's had on their business. And the responses were interesting. I've got to say that a lot of farmers probably didn't have a concept of what globalisation actually was and what the impacts really were on their own businesses. So when you're putting together a presentation, I think you've really got to go back and start at the basics. You know, what is globalisation, and work from there as to what it means, and to try and put down in say 10 or 11 words, what is globalisation? And if we look at the definition, it is basically the process of increasing the connectivity and interdependence of countries around the world. And that flows down to industries, to businesses and so forth. So the question then, globalisation, is it free trade? Is it better transport, better communication, better technology, enhancing that connectivity? Or are those things actually leading to greater globalisation and a greater awareness of globalisation? So then I thought, when did this phenomenon really start? Was it this century? Was it back in the 1990s, 80s, 70s? When you think about the history of the world, globalisation has been around for not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years. It's probably not recognised. When early civilisations travelled around the world and connected with each other. When we go back and look at things such as the spice trade, one of the early examples of globalisation in agriculture, when camel caravans travelled across the world and then moved to sea freight, connecting Asia, the Mediterranean world, Europe. Trade on the Silk Road was credited as being a significant factor in the development of some of the great civilisations such as China, India, Egypt, Arabia, Rome and so forth. And out of that there's a very clear lesson for us, that those industries, those economies, those countries that embraced globalisation actually grew and prospered. So it's obviously not a new phenomenon, but the term globalisation, the modern term, what we look at today and what we consider globalisation, probably had its origins post-World War II, when a number of countries and economists looked at increasing that interconnectivity. And we've seen those economies and countries and industries grow that have embraced globalisation. So is it good? Is it bad? Has Australian agriculture, particularly the grains industry, embraced globalisation? There's many perspectives. If you're a factory worker at Geelong working for Ford, you're probably not a great fan of globalisation. If you're a consumer that likes the latest technology and has cheaper electronic goods and cheaper clothes, you'll think it's wonderful. If you're a farmer using the best technologies from around the world, exporting your produce to the rest of the world, you'll probably like globalisation. If you're struggling due to a number of factors, you're probably blaming globalisation. So it's from where you sit is your perspective. And I answer the question, has Australia embraced globalisation? And I know the comments of our first two speakers. As a nation, to an extent, we have. But there's still areas where I think we're a little bit half pregnant. As agriculture and the grains industry, most definitely they have embraced globalisation. Whether it fully identified it was doing so at the time, whether it had a clear strategy to do so or not, is debatable. But it's certainly embraced globalisation. And from a farmer, what does it really mean to me? Where does it impact on my business? And you can pull a few of the usual suspects: trade, information, technology, finance, investment. All of those things are having a greater impact on my business because of globalisation. If I start with trade, and once upon a time, years ago, I was competing with my neighbour because we're all getting the same price. It was, could I do the job a little bit better and buy him out eventually? But now I'm competing with growers around the rest of the world. That's where my competition is. It's not my next door neighbour. It's no longer a domestic market. We're operating in a truly international marketplace. And it doesn't matter whether you're on the East Coast with a strong domestic market or the West Coast with a strongly focused export market for your grain. The international influences are determining pretty much the values in most years that you'll receive for your grain. You know, we export 70% of what we produce. You know, we need to be part of a much larger marketplace than Australia can supply us. And if we look at trade, and we look at some of those earlier ideals of those economists and those countries that embrace globalisation, they put together forums such as the GATT round, the Uruguay round. We as farmers have benefited from that. I know that world trade is far from perfect, and there are still subsidies around the world which do distort trade. But basically we have seen some significant improvements in the way in which those countries assist their farmers or distort the marketplace. We have seen a reduction in the subsidies and the tariffs which distort. That's been a boon to my business as a farmer operating with minimal government assistance. Information is, so I'll go back, there's also some cons with trade. You know, I've got to face greater competition from around the world. The producer who is the least cost producer in a truly global marketplace has that advantage. So I need to make sure that my business is as efficient as it can be, but I also need to rely on that agribusiness that supports me, that government policy which has an impact, allows my business to be one of the most cost-efficient producers that it possibly can be. If I look at information, and early on in a farming career I realised information was king. The more information you had, the better informed you could be, the better your decision making could be, until you got to the stage of too much information you became very confused. But basically information was king. You know, where is the supply and demand? What's the demand domestically, internationally? Accuracy and dissemination is the key to that information though, but it provides me with greater choice. Finance. And there's no doubt that I have access to increased opportunities for finance and costs more in line with the rest of the world. Yes, there are some government policies in Australia which dictate to an extent, but basically we're seeing finance more in line with the rest of the world because of globalisation. Investment across the supply chain in production. We're seeing greater investment from overseas in the Australian grains industry. Investment that we wouldn't capture domestically, and that's led to increasing the efficiencies. And if we look back at another agricultural industry, the cotton industry, it was investment from a number of US growers back in the early 60s. I think Peter Corrie should be familiar with those things, and David Anthony as people being well involved in the cotton industry. That foreign investment delivered to Australia another great agricultural industry which has grown and prospered and provided another opportunity for farmers, particularly in my part of the world. An area that I do know a little bit about over the last few years is technology and research and development. It's now global. Access to technology from around the world, genetics. If we look at the Australian wheat crop, you know, there's nothing native to Australia. We've imported all our genetics. If we go back to the 70s and look at the work out of CIMMYT, the International Centre for Maize and Wheat Improvement, the semi-dwarf varieties revolutionised wheat growing across Australia, lifted our productivity enormously. It did so around the world, but we had access to those genetics, access to that technology. If we look at the various chemical compounds, the cost of producing those today, if we're insular in Australia, we would not be able to afford those new compounds, those new technologies that we use that make my business more successful. Technology, information, things such as the chipping now. So being able to look at a grain of wheat, take a little chip out of that and identify what the genetics were in that wheat, it will make significant advances in our breeding across Australia in future years. I, as a grower, will benefit greatly from that. The productivity enhances. And when I look at this season, as I spoke about earlier, if it hadn't been for that technology, a lot of it we've been able to bring from around the world and adapt to Australian conditions, we would not have produced half of what we did this year. And of course with trade rules comes IP protection and those sorts of things, which do lead to increased investment. They do give us the opportunity to develop technologies in Australia and to get a return on those technologies if we take them to the rest of the world. We look at our machinery sector, tractors, harvesters, the technology that we use today. There's no way that Australia could develop the technologies at a cost-efficient measure that we need to grow our crops today. So there's a lot of positives for my business. There's also some downsides. You know, in a global market, I'm certainly at the risk of those international markets. Decisions by overseas investors, overseas governments impact on my business. We've only got to look at the subprime loan fiasco, which caused the global financial crisis, what that did to the values of grain, how that impacted on individual growers across Australia. The European debt crisis. You know, they are impacts of globalisation and they impact back at the farm level. When India recently announced they were putting a large amount of wheat on the market at well below other prices that were going around the world, that impacts on the price that I will receive for my grain. And then, of course, when Russia put export bans on that was quite a significant boost to the price that I would get for my grain. So it's not all good. But if we look at globalisation and we assume basically that globalisation is good, and when I was thinking about this presentation, I actually thought it'd be a little bit cheeky to come up and have an opposing view to my two other speakers and pretend I was a farmer from, say, Rankin Springs or somewhere and give you a very different view. But I resisted the temptation. So if we assume globalisation is generally positive, generally beneficial, we shouldn't assume that the benefits will naturally flow. We do need to act, just like we shouldn't assume the Asian boom benefits will naturally flow to Australia. We need to ensure we have government policies that are right, which encourage us working in an environment of globalisation. Corporate strategies are absolutely critical to support my business. You know, the governance of those organisations, the vision, the strategies that they put forward need to be thought-provoking, need to be in a way in which embraces globalisation and brings the advantages back to Australia. And farmers need to be progressive and recognise what globalisation does for them. We need to be informed by utilising the best around the world to be the best around the world. Thank you. Thanks very much.